disaster, don't be scared. Be prepared.
Welcome to Guts and Guns.
We're here to cut through the noise and really get to the heart of things using a whole stack of sources. Today, we're diving into Thanksgiving. You know, a holiday that feels deeply American. For so many of us, the picture is, well, it's pretty clear, isn't it? Pilgrims, Native Americans sharing this harmonious feast, gratitude, unity. It's a really powerful story, comforting even.
It is. It's deeply embedded. But when you dig into the history, as we've done for this deep dive, you find that popular image is, well, it's a simplification. You could even call it a carefully constructed cultural myth.
Right. So our mission today is to kind of deconstruct that myth. We want to offer an evidence-based look, get beyond the simple story.
Exactly. Because what's fascinating is that the holiday you celebrate today isn't some direct, unbroken line from 1621. It's more like a layered historical artifact. It's been shaped over centuries by, political aims, commercial interests, even significant social conflicts.
Okay, so we're going to peel back those layers.
Yeah. First, we'll look at what really motivated the English colonists and the Wampanoag people back in 1621. Then, we'll jump forward to the 19th century, see how political forces actually forged a national holiday. And finally, we'll touch on the ongoing cultural struggles, the debates that define Thanksgiving even now.
So by the end, you, the listener, should have a much richer, more nuanced view of Thanksgiving, seeing it as this dynamic reflection of American identity.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then, or what many think is the beginning. That 1621 event, the quote-unquote first Thanksgiving. We imagine this unique moment of shared gratitude. But what actually happened that autumn in Plymouth?
Well, it was a 3-day harvest celebration. That much is true. But crucially, no one at the time called it Thanksgiving. And the whole idea of giving thanks, that wasn't new to the continent when the English arrived, not at all.
Interesting. So the Wampanoag already had traditions.
Absolutely. Thousands of years of them. Ceremonies for good harvests, for births, for good fortune. For the Wampanoag, gratitude wasn't like a once-a-year thing. It was woven into daily life, into their spirituality. They had ceremonies in early spring and fall.
And the English colonists, they had their own Thanksgiving traditions too, but different.
Very different. Their days of Thanksgiving were usually quite solemn, religious, often declared for a specific reason, a specific blessing, and marked by prayer and fasting, not feasting. In fact, the first time the Plymouth colonists themselves record something they called Thanksgiving was in 1623, and that was a day of prayer after rain ended a drought.
So the later myth-making just kind of glossed over all that pre-existing context, both Indigenous and English.
Pretty much. It presented 1621 as this unique, pioneering moment of gratitude, which just wasn't accurate.
Okay, let's talk about the relationship then. The story often paints this picture of, instant friendship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag.
Yeah, and that's another key part of the myth that needs unpacking. It wasn't an idyllic friendship. It was really a calculated alliance.
Calculated? How so?
Both groups were in incredibly difficult situations, desperate even, the Pilgrims. They were struggling just to survive. Remember, only 52 out of the original 102 Mayflower passengers made it through that first brutal winter. They were living in makeshift shelters.
And the Wampanoag.
They were also in a really precarious spot. A huge epidemic, likely leptospirosis from European ships between maybe 1615 and 1619, had wiped out up to 90% of their local population.
90%, wow.
Yeah, it left them incredibly vulnerable, especially to their powerful rivals, the Narragansett people.
So these dire circumstances kind of pushed them together.
Exactly. Months before that harvest feast in March 1621, they signed a formal treaty. A strategic treaty of mutual protection. The Wampanoag needed allies against the Narragansett. The Pilgrims desperately needed allies and, frankly, guidance on how to survive.
And this is where Tisquantum, or Squanto, comes in.
Right. He's a key figure. A Wampanoag man who'd actually learned English years before after being captured and taken to Europe. He acted as a vital translator. And crucially, he taught the colonists how to plant local crops, especially corn, Indian corn, which absolutely saved them from starvation.
So the common story of just spontaneous goodwill, it really misses that pragmatic core. It was a transaction, an alliance for survival.
It romanticizes a very difficult complex situation. And it also feeds into that myth of the Pilgrims finding this sort of empty, unsettled land, which wasn't the case.
Okay, what about the feast itself? What did the actual records say?
Well, we have two main colonial accounts from the time. William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation and Edward Winslow's Mort's Relation. And again, neither of them calls the event Thanksgiving. Winslow wrote that the settlers, for 3 days, we entertained and feasted. He mentions the Wampanoag leader Usamaquin, who the English called Massasoit, joined them with about 90 of his men.
And they contributed food.
Yes. Winslow mentions Massasoit's men hunted and brought 5 deer. There's also a later account suggesting the Wampanoag might have shown up initially because they heard celebratory gunfire from the settlement and, under their treaty, came to see if the Pilgrims needed help. Then they stayed and joined the feast.
Makes sense given the Defense Pact. So what was actually on the menu? Forget the modern image for a second.
It was quite different. Definitely wildfowl geese, ducks, possibly some wild turkey, though it wasn't the guaranteed centerpiece it is now. There was the venison, of course, brought by the Wampanoag. Corn would have been there, probably as bread or maybe a porridge. And lots of seafood, lobster, clams, mussels were abundant.
What wasn't there?
Well, none of the stuff we consider essential today. No pies or cakes. They lacked wheat flour, butter, refined sugar. No mashed potatoes. Potatoes weren't common then.
So the modern menu, the turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce, the pumpkin pie that came much later?
Much later. It was a deliberate transformation, really. Kind of a culinary creation designed to fit the 19th century myth, making it a comforting, standardized ritual. It erases the rawness of 1621 and the Wampanoag's crucial contribution of venison.
And another thing often left out of the simple story is what happened next. The myth usually ends with the feast.
Right. It rarely includes a Native American perspective on the long-term consequences, and it almost never acknowledges that the peace, such as it was, didn't last.
How long did it last?
The formal treaty held for over 50 years, remarkably. But as more English settlers arrived, tensions inevitably rose. Land disputes, resource competition. Within a generation, Massasoit's own son, Metacomet, whom the colonists called King Philip, adopted a much more resistant stance. This eventually erupted into King Philip's War in the 1670s.
And that was devastating.
Absolutely devastating for the Wampanoag and other indigenous peoples in the region. They lost their political independence, huge amounts of land. It was brutal. So for many Native Americans today, Thanksgiving isn't a celebration. It's actually a painful reminder of colonization, land theft, and cultural loss.
And the 19th century myths just ignored all that.
Deliberately. By focusing only on that brief 1621 moment of cooperation, it created a sanitized origin story. It romanticized the founding to essentially justify the westward expansion and conquest that were happening in the 19th century.
Wow. Okay, so that's the reality of 1621, fact versus myth.
Yeah.
But the holiday we have now, you said it wasn't a direct continuation. It was reimagined much later.
Exactly. That takes us into the second part of our story, the 19th century, and the politics behind making Thanksgiving a national holiday.
So for what, 150 years after Plymouth, there was no annual Thanksgiving holiday?
Not in the way we think of it. There were occasional Thanksgiving days, yes, declared by colonial governments, later by states. But they were usually those solemn religious affairs we mentioned, irregular, not a fixed annual thing.
What about during the Revolution? I seem to recall something about Washington.
You're right. The Continental Congress declared days of thanks for military victories. General Washington did too. And later, as president, Washington issued proclamations, one in 1789 for the Constitution, another in 1795 after the Whiskey Rebellion. But these were one-off events. They tied the idea of Thanksgiving to patriotism, sure, but they didn't establish a permanent recurring holiday.
Okay, so when did that push begin? This is where Josepha Hale comes in, the godmother of Thanksgiving.
Precisely. She's a key figure. Josepha Hale was the incredibly influential editor of Goody's Ladies' Book. Think of it as like the premier women's magazine of its time. Starting in the 1830s, she began this relentless campaign, spanning decades, writing editorials, lobbying politicians, all to get Thanksgiving established as a unified national holiday, celebrated on the same day across the country.
And Goody's Ladies' Book had a huge reach, right?
Massive.
Yeah.
By 1860, it reached something like 150,000 households every month. So she had this enormous platform. She used it to promote her vision of Thanksgiving. a pious, patriotic, family-centered, domestic holiday.
Was it just about having a nice family holiday, or was there more to it?
Oh, it was deeply political for Hale. This was the era of rising sectional tension, the decades leading up to the Civil War. She was deeply worried about the country splitting apart. She saw Thanksgiving as a potential unifying force, a shared ritual that could create a sort of standardized American identity. Her magazine published recipes, stories about families celebrating, implicitly promoting these sort of white Protestant Northern values as the American way, even while showing diverse people participating.
So she's pushing this for decades. And then comes Lincoln's proclamation in 1863. Was that just because of her campaign?
Her campaign was absolutely crucial. It laid the groundwork, created the public appetite. But Lincoln's proclamation in 1863 came at a very specific, critical moment, the height of the Civil War. The Union had just had major victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Lincoln, likely prompted by Hale's continued lobbying and seeing the strategic value, declared the last Thursday of November a National Day of Thanksgiving.
So it was a strategic political act during wartime.
Definitely. It was meant to boost morale, unify the northern states, frame the Union cause in sort of divine terms, give thanks for blessings and singular deliverances, even amidst this horrific war. It cemented that patriotic purpose Hale had envisioned, but now tied directly to preserving the Union.
Okay, so the holiday is officially established nationwide. But you mentioned earlier this involved creating an origin myth.
Yes, this is where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit uncomfortable. Once the national holiday existed, it needed a national story, a distinctly American origin story. And that's when that 1621 Harvest Festival, which had been largely forgotten or just seen as a local event, gets dusted off and sort of remade. It's repositioned as the first Thanksgiving.
And this served a purpose beyond just having a nice story.
A very specific political purpose, especially in the later 19th century. This newly crafted narrative of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a peaceful, harmonious meal became incredibly useful. Why? Because it helped justify westward expansion and the whole ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the continent.
How did a story about sharing a meal justify taking land?
By presenting the founding interaction between Europeans and Native peoples as peaceful and cooperative, it created a narrative that obscured or even implicitly legitimized the often violent reality of colonization that was happening at that very moment in the West. It allowed the nation to celebrate this sanitized, harmonious beginning while simultaneously engaging in wars against indigenous nations and taking their land throughout the late 19th century. It's a powerful contradiction.
So it created a comforting historical foundation that smoothed over the rough edges of expansion.
Exactly. A sanitized history for a nation undergoing massive, often brutal transformation.
Wow. Okay, quick recap then. 1621 was a desperate harvest feast and alliance. Then, over a century of irregular Thanksgivings. Hale campaigns for decades for unity. Lincoln makes it official in 63 during the war.
Yeah.
And then the 1621 story gets repurposed as this founding myth to justify expansion.
That's the trajectory, yes. Quite a journey from that autumn day in Plymouth.
Which brings us to today, the modern Thanksgiving. You mentioned it continues to evolve, reflecting commercialism, entertainment.
And also, importantly, a growing public awareness and reckoning with that more complex history we've been discussing.
Because let's face it, many of our modern traditions, they don't really connect back to 1621 or even necessarily to Hale's pious vision.
Not directly, no. Take the turkey. We mentioned it wasn't the guaranteed star in 1621. It became the standard centerpiece, partly thanks to Hale promoting it in her recipes in the mid-19th century. It was also practical. A big bird could feed a large family, more economical than beef for many, and unlike chickens or cows, it didn't produce eggs or milk.
And football. How'd that become a Thanksgiving thing?
That started pretty early, actually. College football games on Thanksgiving date back to the 1870s, 1876 being a key early matchup. Professional football came later. The Detroit Lions started their tradition in the 1930s. It was actually a marketing gimmick by the team owner to boost attendance for a struggling team, and it stuck.
Huh. And the parades. Macy's is iconic, but they weren't the first.
No, Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia actually held the first big Thanksgiving Day parade in 1920. Macy's followed a few years later in New York. And the purpose? Purely commercial. It was designed explicitly to kick off the Christmas shopping season.
So, turkey, football, parades, these really transformed the holiday again, didn't they? Away from solemn reflection or even just Hale's domestic ideal, towards
a largely secular day focused on family gathering, yes, but also heavily on consumption, entertainment, and sport. Further and further removed from its historical roots, both the 1621 event and the 19th century intentions.
But alongside these popular traditions, there's another much more somber perspective, the Indigenous counter-narrative.
Absolutely crucial to understand this. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is not a celebration. As we touched on, it's often seen as a painful symbol. A reminder of, in their words, the genocide of millions of Native people, the theft of Native lands, and the erasure of Native cultures. That peaceful 1621 myth completely ignored the devastating context of colonization that followed.
And this led to the National Day of Mourning.
Yes. This started in 1970. It was organized by the United American Indians of New England, and it takes place in Plymouth, Massachusetts on Thanksgiving Day, right near Plymouth Rock.
What sparked it?
It was quite specific. A Wampanoag man named Frank Wamsutta James was invited to speak at a state dinner celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing. But when the organizers saw his speech beforehand, they uninvited him.
Why? What was in the speech?
It wasn't the sanitized story they wanted. He planned to talk about the Pilgrims robbing Wampanoag graves, stealing their corn stores when they first arrived, and the subsequent violence and land theft. The real history.
So what did he do?
He refused to be silenced. He went to Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day 1970 and delivered that speech publicly, and that gathering became the first National Day of Mourning. It's been held every year since.
What's his purpose?
It's a protest against the Thanksgiving myth. It's a day to honor Native ancestors, to mourn the losses caused by colonization, and to draw attention to the ongoing struggles Indigenous peoples face today. It directly confronts that sanitized history.
So Thanksgiving today is this really complex, contested space.
It really is. You have the mainstream celebration, the commercial aspects, and then you have this powerful counter-narrative of mourning and protest.
Is there any middle ground or new ways people are approaching it?
There's definitely a growing conversation. Even within Indigenous communities, the day can be complex. For some, while acknowledging the mourning, it's also become an opportunity to gather, to celebrate their own resilience, cultural survival, and community. Sometimes this involves focusing on traditional Indigenous foods, reclaiming food sovereignty as an act of resistance against historical erasure.
And has the National Day of Mourning influenced how non-Native people think about the holiday?
I think it has, increasingly. It's prompted a noticeable shift, or at least the beginning of one. More people are learning the history, questioning the myths. You see more efforts towards education around Thanksgiving, acknowledging the land people are on, supporting Indigenous artists or businesses. Some Indigenous leaders encourage using the day not just for feasting, but for reflection on this shared, often difficult history and what responsibilities come with that knowledge.
So the holiday becomes a kind of microcosm for broader American struggles around history, identity, and justice.
Perfectly put. It encapsulates so much.
Okay, so bringing this all together, Thanksgiving, as we experience it, is just incredibly layered. It's not one simple thing.
Not at all. It's this complex tapestry. Fact, myth, political maneuvering, commercialism, resistance. It's all woven in there.
So the key takeaways from our deep dive. 1621 wasn't Thanksgiving. It was a pragmatic harvest feast born from mutual desperation.
Right. The national holiday, a 19th century political creation pushed by Hale for unity, solidified by Lincoln during war.
And that 1621 story was then reframed as a founding myth to justify expansion.
While modern traditions like turkey, football parades are mostly 20th century additions, largely commercial.
And critically, it remains a contested space, with the National Day of Mourning highlighting the painful history the myth erases.
To really get Thanksgiving, you have to hold all those pieces. The ancient Wampanoag traditions of gratitude, the Pilgrim's struggle, Hale's vision, Lincoln's strategy, the painful legacy for Indigenous peoples, the modern commercialism, and the ongoing acts of resistance and reclamation.
Its enduring legacy isn't in the simple myth, but in that complex, challenging, true history.
A history that keeps asking us to reflect on where the nation came from and what its values really are.
So as the holiday season approaches, we hope you, the listener, carry this more layered understanding with you. It's always valuable, we think, to look beyond the surface story, to grasp those deeper currents of history.
And maybe it leaves you with something to think about. How does knowing this complex history change how you see Thanksgiving or tradition itself? And, maybe more importantly, what responsibilities might come with that knowledge?
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Tune in again.